why I'm here, but or what I can contribute to the conversation in terms of the ongoing genocide in Gaza that has unfolded over the past year and a half almost, that many other more credible speakers could speak to convincingly from a point of personal involvement and a position of authority. Having said that, however, I'm going to try to do my best here. This august body has seen some of the best minds inside of its halls, and now it's hosting a Twitch streamer. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you following the footsteps of intellectual giants as nothing but a simple man who understands right from wrong, and sometimes that's all that matters. In the words of my friend, the late great Michael Jamal Brooks, there's nothing complicated about apartheid. The morality of it is clear. If the roles were reversed and a captive Jewish population of 5 million people were being systematically starved, sieged, and dominated, everyone would understand what's going on. Its ancestral lands being destroyed, everyone would understand what's going on. So in his words, it's not a complex issue. It's super simple. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States, the most powerful country on the planet, and it acts on another population of people with total impunity, and is never held accountable for anything. Well, I guess some things are changing in that regard, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But there is no symmetry in this relationship, period. That's what Michael Jamal Brooks said. So I see no need for obfuscation, no arguments for complexity, no reasoning for preemptive genocide. Israel is an apartheid state, and its inception was a violent one, with the forced displacement of 700,000, which gave birth to a settler colonial entity that continues to dominate the lives of more than 5 million Palestinians under its illegal occupation, totaling 15 million Palestinians around the globe that are permanently displaced. Its demographic concerns, Israel's demographic concerns, are never seen in the same lens that we view nationalist and fascist projects of the past. It also happens to be one of the most impressive nationalist projects the world has ever seen, from the revitalization of Hebrew as a language to finding a nation state for a revolutionary people who had been historically oppressed, victim to countless pogroms and the Holocaust. Israel could have been a story of success and overcoming great odds, except its inception was built around a lie, that this was a land without people for a people without land. Albert Einstein called out that lie early on as well. 10 years before the inception of Israel, Einstein described the proposed creation of the state as something which conflicted with the essential nature of Judaism. He warned against the violence of Menachem Begin and many other early Zionist militias. In 1948, Einstein and a number of Jewish academics sent a letter to the New York Times to protest against a visit to America by Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin also was never able to actually come to the UK either for his involvement in previous bombing campaigns as well. In this letter, they denounced Begin's Herut, Freedom Party, likening it to a political party closely akin in its organization, in its methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. Einstein understood the dangers that nationalism of this sort presented. After all, he had fled Nazi Germany. Nowadays, this sort of analysis is met with tremendous resistance. Given our comforts living in the heart of empire, we focus more on the feelings of those in the West rather than the violence that our tax dollars are contributing to. But I want to go back to the beginning for a little bit, which helped me understand the ways in which Israel's violence has remained unchecked, especially because the similarities in the contemporary way that Israel has dished out its violence are glaringly obvious. I want to talk about the atrocities committed in Deir Yassin, the former Palestinian village a few miles west of Jerusalem. I say former because in April 1948, over 100 of its Arab residents were executed. ruthlessly slaughtered. There were graphic stories that were told of some of the survivors, including but not limited to having a baker and his son lined up against the baker's oven and trying to force the baker to throw his son in the oven. And when he refused to cooperate, throwing his son in the oven and then throwing him in afterwards. The only reason why we know is because there were survivors that were left to tell the story. So they could go and tell the other Arab villages that if the Zionist brigades were coming, that they must evacuate. The massacre was committed by Zionist forces. Radical right-wingers led the attack, but were supported by the Haganah, which later became the IDF. But Deir Yassin was not an isolated massacre. It was a pivotal moment. Deir Yassin helped convince the Arab governments to fight Israel. People fled their towns and villages, fearful that what happens at Deir Yassin might happen in their towns. 700,000 people never allowed to return to their homes. Palestinians call this the Nakba. It's also known as catastrophe. But this wasn't just the fog of war. The Nakba was, in the words of historian Ilan Pape, a master plan for the massive expulsion of Palestinians, also called Plan D or Plan Dalet. Hundreds of thousands were expelled before Israel's so-called War of Independence had ever started. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, to use Pape's words, orchestrated the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. These were not merely nationalists or settlers run amok. This was clearly defined state policy. To this very day, Israel denies having forcibly expelled Palestinians, instead claiming that they voluntarily left their homes. This myth can be considered one of the earliest and perhaps most powerful forms of Hasbara. In Hebrew, Hasbara means advocacy or explanation. In the Western world, it just means lying. In 1948, there were Jewish extremists supported by the main military raiding and depopulating Palestinian communities. In 2024, we have the same problem. In 1948, the Israeli government told the world that Palestinians were responsible for their own suffering, lying about the orphans, widows, and the homeless that Israel had created. In 2024, we have the same problem. And in 1948, when people all over the world took notice of Israel's savage treatment of Palestinians, Israel could only respond by lying, using Hasbara to tell a different kind of story about its atrocities. In 2024, we still have the same problem. Now, people always ask me, Hasan, why is Israel so important? And I think this is a rhetorical trick. Why is Israel's allegiance to America so important? I think a lot of people ask this in earnest, but some people ask because they want me to say anti-Semitic things. They think that I'm going to say, oh, because Jews are powerful, they control the media, they control the government. This is not true. That's not the reason. At this point, at different points throughout time, the story in Israel and Palestine has been more or less the same. But ultimately, Israel has served different purposes for the United States, its primary benefactor. Israel has been our Cold War ally. Israel has been a punisher of misbehaving Arab oil states. Israel has been a partner in Western espionage. It is an unsinkable aircraft carrier in a resource-rich region. That's very important to American State Department interests. But for 66 years, the violence has continued, with broad support from the West. The Israeli government has been free to occupy Palestinian lands and destroy Palestinian life. Ever since the failure of the Oslo peace process in 2000, the rise of the settler movement, and Benjamin Netanyahu taking control of the Israeli government, America's ironclad support for Israel has remained exactly that. But in the last decade, something has changed. Two things have changed, as a matter of fact. The first is that Israel has totally lost the younger generation. The younger generation of Americans, but also the younger generation of the Western world in general, who are shocked by its policies in occupied Palestinian lands. And the second thing that has happened is that Israel's powerful advocates in U.S. politics and media, the Israel lobby, no longer have a total stranglehold on the left and the right. The media is not as favorable to Israel as it once was. I'm obviously a living, breathing example of this. I think someone like myself would not exist in any other format, in any other medium, in any other time. But that's not the entire story, obviously. I'm not just here to focus on myself and what I do. I think I want to talk a little bit more about the broader picture, the bigger picture. You never could really hide a genocide from the world, but it's especially difficult in the present moment. Every day we are inundated with footage from Gaza of untold atrocities, countless atrocities. We see depictions of the worst that humanity has to offer. We see children in body bags, drone strikes, mass displacement, the horror. We see missing relatives, sick babies, wailing mothers, and so on. This accumulation of this evidence, freely available on today's internet, is what is currently burying Israel in the court of public opinion. It's turning Israel into a pariah state. Hasbara wasn't built to refute this many dead children. Israel was really bailed out in the media in the past because of how slow the establishment press was to recognize the atrocities that are unfolding. It took prestigious outlets many weeks and months to tentatively identify an obvious genocide that quickly came together in a matter of days. Nowadays, you learn about the gruesome conditions of Sde Teiman, a concentration camp, or quadcopters sniping children, or broadcasting the sound of children crying for help to lure out unsuspecting Palestinians with the express purpose of murder, months before it reaches the headlines of legacy publishers in the West. That is, if they're covered at all, like the pro-rape riots, pro-rape January 6th, that took place after the Israeli government tried to prosecute 9 concentration camp guards for, I'm sorry for using this language here, but for raping Palestinian prisoners to death on camera. I say tried because not only did the riots succeed, the main perpetrator became a television personality. And so we have learned since October 7 that Israel can conduct such wide-scale atrocities, killings, kidnappings, and bombings and expulsions, even without its usual PR shield, so long as its actual political shield in Washington holds up, as well as the Iron Dome. Now, there is a subtle but horribly corrosive effect that this has had on how people understand the world around them. At the very moment when fact-based reporting and serious journalism is most needed in this time, people are distrustful of the news. Platforms like Twitter routinely surface the worst of the worst kinds of content, but the most divisive, most hateful content. But Elon Musk is not the only person responsible for this. And I hate Elon Musk, okay? I hate Elon Musk as much as you guys hate Oxford College. I heard that if I say that, I'll get some applause breaks there. So that was my exit ramp. But it's not just Elon Musk, it's not just Twitter. It's happening all around. Young people, men in particular, who don't have much education or literacy skills with no hopeful prospects of the future are being propagandized by waves of right-wing influencers who have never had megaphones this loud. Although this issue most often gets brought up in the context of the 2024 election and Donald Trump, there's more to this. I think it's important to connect it to Palestine as well. These are forces who want to normalize the current levels of violence and to convince people that actually it's good to be this bloodthirsty. While it was Joe Biden who gave Israel the blank check with which to commit a genocide, that decision has created an entire galaxy of right-wingers who are actually in position to cash it. And cash it they are currently. If you've seen the Donald Trump cabinet picks, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The traditional forces that could keep this kind of thing in check, particularly in politics and in media, are unfortunately weak. And they're getting weaker by the moment. They're out of power. They're broke. They're technologically weak. They don't understand the space. They don't understand the online content creation sphere. And I feel like they've, most importantly, with their coverage, of Gaza discredited themselves to an entire generation. It seems right now that those people who genuinely desire for a better future, who want an alternative to the genocide, will have to start looking amongst themselves, looking within themselves, their friends, and away from the mainstream if they want to help bring something like justice into the world. So I stand before you as a man who simply wants some semblance of justice for the Palestinians. I urge you not to lean into nihilism and succumb to helplessness, because you do not need the academic pedigree to know right from wrong. All you need is your moral compass. As someone who has seen the Palestine question evolve over my past 10 years of public advocacy, I never would have imagined international organs demand legal restitution from America's most valuable asset. After all, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. Thank you. It's a little bit more somber of a tone than I take normally.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that speech. Just to run through how the rest of the evening will work, I'm going to do a moderated interview Q&A, and then after a while we're going to throw it open to questions in the audience, or we'll bring you a mic. Just to reiterate, this event is being live streamed on Twitch, so bear that in mind when you ask a question, if that's something you might not be comfortable with. Where I wanted to start, just picking up from where you ended that speech, of where we should look to, where people should look to if they want to affect change, of looking outside the mainstream. We've seen a lot of student movements here in Cambridge, over in America, of students taking direct action to try and change the policy of the government towards Palestine. How optimistic are you about the potential for change from these kind of movements?
I'm more optimistic than I've ever been, because as I kind of alluded to in the end of that speech, anyone that has been aware of the situation in Palestine for longer than, 5 years, will be the first to tell you that the attitude from the Western world is dramatically different. This doesn't mean that the governments have changed their attitude or shifted their policies, although some have, and it's unique, especially, and I stress the importance of the Western world specifically, because I think the Global South has known what a settler colonial apparatus looks like with their own personal experience with such things. But the allegiances that America needs to maintain in Europe, and even its own population, and the outlook that people have organically has shifted dramatically in the position of maybe not full-blown emancipation for Palestinians, but at least like some recognition for the atrocities. And I think that is truly unique, and it's a sign of hope despite all of the horrifying things that we see on a daily basis.
So what does a path look like for you towards genuine change in the Israel-Palestine situation?
I think we have also completely nullified mechanisms of pressure. In the past, we at least had labor unions that even engaged in militancy at times, and we've completely neutered them in the Western world, especially in America. Our labor union participation rate is around 10%. It's actually lower than Chile, which is a country that we specifically wrote the Constitution of to institute a neoliberal project there, and they still have a higher labor union participation rate than we do. And I think that is one of the major issues. So I hope that people can focus on unionization and engaging in community activism a little bit more in this process. And I think that under the Trump administration, people will be forced to do that regardless. Participate more in politics by not directly participating in the democratic process, but organizations outside of just simply voting for the Democratic Party, for example. Political actions like that are necessary. Yeah. And that's the only way that I think this pressure valve will release.
Do you think that Western governments' reluctance to endorse rulings such as the ICC against Benjamin Netanyahu, do you see that as something fundamentally damaging, or are you already less optimistic about how much change those kinds of international institutions can have?
I mean, I think it's unique when you see the very fact that the ICC prosecutions are even taking place. It's obvious that this is a new step. These organs of international justice, the Geneva Conventions, or I guess in American terms, the Geneva Suggestions, the United Nations, like all of these international organs that are supposed to uphold humanitarian laws and principles are historically only used against the enemies of the West. And some American politicians are very open about that. I believe it was Lindsey Graham that might have had a conversation with Karim Khan in private. Karim Khan is the current ICC prosecutor that actually facilitated the arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. And in that private correspondence, I believe he told him that the ICC is not there for our allies. They're there for African warlords and thugs like Putin. And technically, throughout its inception, throughout the way that these international organs of justice have worked, that is true. That is what they've usually had in the crosshairs. So I think things are changing, and while this kind of broad sweeping change is not going to happen overnight, I do feel optimistic. And ultimately, there is, especially if there's continuous pressure from the public against the governments, that inevitably they are going to have to succumb to that pressure. Or they're going to have to become more militant and maybe even more fascist in an effort to quell the naysayers, the people that are protesting against the government. We've seen a little bit of that in America in the way that our campus protests were packed up. There were prosecutions that took place, which is very unique in a country where we are supposed to be the bastion of free speech. But I think all of that resistance only causes people to grow more and more angry. And there's only so much a government can do when there's enough people that say this is inappropriate, it's done.
Yeah, you've received backlash at various points for what people perceive as excessive sympathy towards groups like the Houthis or Hezbollah, who share your opposition to Israel, but may have what many would think of as quite regressive views in other areas. Is that something you think about, worry about?
No, not necessarily. In terms of their domestic affairs, a lot of these like militant movements, these non-state actors, I am not aligned with at all. Having said that, however, that is not the reason for why they are persecuted or killed in many instances. Like Hasan Nasrallah, he's homophobic, right? Yeah, I know that. But they didn't kill him because he was homophobic. They killed him because he was a part of the axis of resistance. So I don't place a lot of emphasis on the internal dynamics and internal policies of these resistance groups, just as I don't care that America was homophobic, segregationist, and misogynistic when they aligned against the Nazi rise of power. I still rooted for Easy Company. And every time I watch Band of Brothers, I still stand up and salute, you know, because they did what had to be done in that regard. And I can't even change the political discourse in my own theoretical democracy. So I feel like the hypothetical conversation that we're having about the civil governance of these militant groups is simply to just say, well, they're bad too. They're bad too. They deserve punishment. When in fact, the real reason I think people are critical of them is because of their opposition to Israel. I mean, I'll take it one step further. The Gulf allies that America have done a metric ton worse things than even Hezbollah has in terms of its own like personal civil governance, but that's never a point of contention with our allegiance with Saudi Arabia, for example. That's unconditional. That allegiance happens because they are a very valuable asset in the region. They're a client state. We give them unlimited weapons. They sometimes use those weapons on Yemen. And that dynamic is never called into question because I don't think that honest State Department employees care about that. They care about their goals in the region.
Aside from domestic political change in the US and across the West, what do you think a permanent, stable solution looks like in the area that is currently now split between Israel and Palestine?
So this is, I have a rather controversial opinion on this, I guess, but I take note from the likes of Avi Shlaim, who have also evolved in their understanding of Israel-Palestine and have found themselves in the one-state solution camp, and I'm definitely there as well, because the settlement expansion project that happened, that coincided with the so-called peace process, made a two-sovereign state solution virtually impossible. Either you have to forcibly expel 750,000 settlers from both occupied East Jerusalem and occupied West Bank, which is not only impossible, but would be very violent, or you recognize that the current order of business is that Israel is the singular sovereign state, but it's an apartheid state. And that's the way I approach it. I believe that Israel must dissolve its apartheid and offer citizenship to every single Palestinian, equal rights, equal representation, and become a secular democracy. Israel cannot maintain its demographic concerns. Because what are demographic concerns at the end of the day? I mean, we have demographic concerns in America, but we know exactly what that means when a white supremacist says we have demographic concerns in America. But that calculation is so different when it comes to Israel. Israel's demographic concerns are not seen in the same lens of ethnic and religious superiority implemented by one group and completely dominating and subjugating the outsiders in a similar vein as Nazi Germany or even apartheid South Africa did. It's seen as a mechanism of defense. We have security concerns. We have to have a demographic majority. I can't think of another state that is in the comfortable bosom of Western empire that openly states in its laws that they have to populate certain areas with a certain percentage of Jewish people, or any number of any kind of ethnic group. It doesn't have to just be Jewish people, but that is the reality for Israel. So I think that's old school politics, and I think it has no place in the modern world.
Just to touch on something else you brought up in your speech, social media. Do you think that is something that has fundamentally changed politics, sort of the democratization of information, or do you think that it's the same dynamics playing out over a new medium?
I think it's fundamentally changed politics, sometimes for the good and oftentimes for really awful purposes. I obviously benefit greatly from it. Someone like myself would never be considered a media figure, especially with how isolated mainstream publications are. I feel like I do not fit in the boundaries of permissible speech in mainstream politics and mainstream political discourse. There's a lot more space on the right for that sort of thing, but there's rarely ever any space for the left in this conversation. So yeah, I greatly benefit from the democratization of media. I also understand that for the first time ever, we get to see conflict in real life as it's happening, as it's unfolding. We get to automatically see the victims of American empire or the victims of Israeli actions as real human beings. In the past, I think, and in the early stages, in the immediate aftermath of October 7, CNN and numerous other publications basically kept running the same route. They immediately had a IDF officer that is tasked with basically propagandizing and contextualizing whichever new fresh hell Israel had unfolded upon the Palestinian population. They would go on CNN and immediately talk about how these are terror babies. They had to be killed. This hospital is a terror headquarters. We had to bomb it. And because of TikTok and because of other various social media platforms, people were able to see that that was not the case. People were able to see that, no, you're killing, regular civilians. Like, I know because, I watch them on TikTok. And I think that has definitely played a role in people no longer being as confident in legacy publishers. But there's also the downsides of the democratization of media, whereas people with whichever mindset can go on and do something that we like to call grifting, where you saw a lot of this during COVID, where people were just straight up saying, mainstream narratives on COVID are all false, COVID is fake, it's not real, the vaccines make you gay and autistic, don't take the vaccine. And there was plenty of space for that. Like, some people were actually selling their own personal products and trying to monetize on this. But other people were simply doing it because there was a lot of interest in this. There was a market for fake information. And I don't know how to deal with that. I guess spirited debate is one method, but when the faucet is so when the faucet is open and it's uncontrollable, when there's so much disinformation, I truly don't know how you deal with that.
How do you see your role within that new space? Is it more of an activist, more of a journalist, an entertainer, or some kind of mixture of the three?
I would say a mix of the three. I don't call myself a journalist. I'm a political commentator. But first and foremost, my goal is to be educational, but also be approachable and appealing and entertaining. So I try to make things, I try to make certain subjects that are otherwise complex easier to understand and also entertaining. That's the value I think I provide, and urge people to take action as well, whether it be going to a campus protest, or whether it be unionizing their workplaces, or whether it be joining a local organization. And many members of my community have gone out and done just that. Some have actually gone into local office as well. But outside of that, I also try to combat the misinformation as well, because there's a lot of that out there. I try to hold people's hands through the process of looking at the news. I look at it with a critical lens, and I try to explain to people the biases that certain outlets might have in favor of a particular direction. Omitting key details, burying the lead. Something that a lot of people, I think, are now familiar with is passive voice. This is something that Americans, at least, are very knowledgeable on. Whenever there's any instance of police brutality, the media always makes it seem as though this chaos unfolded on its own. I think mainstream presses utilize the passive voice for all actions that Israel is engaged in as well, quite a bit. Bullets enter the leg of Palestinian. Like, who shot the Palestinian person? Like, how do we get here? I try to explain to people why there are some editorial controls in this regard. But ultimately, I rely heavily on mainstream reporting. I have wonderful friends in these institutions, these outlets that do a tremendous job. And I still greatly value objective news reporting. I wouldn't be able to do what I do without it.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting what you say about the passive voice. We actually had the head of the BBC here a few weeks ago, and I asked him about that, and it's obviously something they think about, but it's obviously up to you how you interpret where that comes from. You did an interview actually on CNN recently, where the concept of you being the left's Joe Rogan was brought up, which is something you're quite dismissive of.
Yeah.
Because you think...
Because I'm not bald. That's what it is.
That's the only difference, of course. You think it's more about policy. It's not about the left finding a Joe Rogan figure. It's about the Democratic Party changing its policies.
Yeah.
Do you think that Is that the right kind of analysis we should take when looking at Donald Trump's election victory, as opposed to policy over sort of the more ephemeral stuff, the media communication?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think Donald Trump represents a shift in attitude towards these institutions that people are obviously very upset about. And one of the major gaps in communication for the Democratic Party was their position as the defenders of American institutions. And it's very obvious, and this is maybe a little bit scary to contend with, but Americans don't care about these institutions. They don't give a shit. They just want the price of eggs to go down. They want housing to be more affordable. And if one side is at least looking at the anger and frustration that people have and saying, you're angry and you're valid to be angry, and you're angry because of marginalized people, you're angry because of the establishment, you're angry because undocumented migrants have actually taken your social safety nets. And the other side is simply saying, no, you shouldn't be angry, things are good. It's a vibe session. The economy is actually not that bad, shut up. You had marginal improvements in your life, why are you complaining? Then yeah, people are going to be like, I'm angry, and that guy at least recognizes that anger. And I think that's what Trump did very well. It wasn't because he's like, he's a policy wonk or anything, of course not. But at the very least, there was a recognition of the frustration that people had. And then he was able to channel that anger and frustration at appropriate targets that, especially in a country like America, have always been under attack regardless. And that's what's very frustrating about this process, because Democrats should technically have the right solutions to these issues. But if they also are zealots in terms of advancing this neoliberal project, this third-way neoliberal attitude unconditionally, yeah, they're going to end up losing over and over again to increasingly more right-wing charlatans like Donald Trump.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of commentators around the Democratic Party and sort of observers here in the UK who would question that characterization of the Biden presidency in particular as unmitigated neoliberalism. They would point to, the Build Back Better Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure spending, the student loan stuff. They would argue, there's an argument that exists that Biden did all that and he still lost, so why does it matter? Why do you think that's wrong?
I think that's wrong because this is something that I saw on Twitter that is just like has burned into my consciousness at this point. But if you see a homeless person and you chuck 2 pennies at them, technically their material wealth improved by 2 cents. They had 0, now they have 2 cents. But the homeless person yells back at you, says, fuck you, throws the pennies back. Why is the homeless person angry at me? I actually improved his material wealth by a dramatic percentage. I don't understand. Why is the homeless person so angry at me now? That is the way that the Democratic Party operates. When I say we need broad left-wing populism, I'm not talking about like a technocratic approach that will maybe unfold a decade later. I'm talking about real, genuine, immediate change. Like Kamala Harris talked about building 3 million housing units. Now, there's a way to do that I think is good, and there's a way to communicate that I think is good, and then there's the way that Kamala Harris communicated it. She said, this is the opportunity economy. She said, we're going to build 3 million housing units with a public-private partnership. This kind of language is just simply undesirable for people outside of the halls of academia, or people who are really invested in YIMBY urbanist Twitter. That's just the unfortunate reality of it. I think she should have come out and been like, we're going to build houses, we're going to do a federal jobs program, we're going to get everybody to work, and we're going to build public housing. We need to claw back the housing market from the hands of everyone that considers homes to be a speculative asset. This is not Wall Street. Every American needs a home. Every American needs shelter. And we're going to give that to you. That is left-wing populism. The technocratic approach that the Democratic Party follows is not left-wing populism. It's just, again, private-public partnership, tax cuts, deregulation. She even talked about deregulating housing. Now that might mean zoning deregulation, or that might mean deregulation that makes houses even shittier than they are in America. And they are pretty shitty. So that's what I mean. If you're going to lie, if you're a politician, and you're not going to implement any of your actual policies, then why not lie about broad, sweeping legislative changes? Why simply lie about the most boring, technocratic, nerdy ways in which you will not actually implement any sort of reasonable changes that will immediately improve people's lives? So while Biden did a lot with the NLRB, for example, and this is something that I've actually talked about quite a bit, there was an issue with communicating that, in my opinion. They failed on that front. Republicans campaign every 4 years, or Republicans campaign every single day for 4 years straight. Democrats only campaign once every 4 years or once every 2 years when they remember there's an election. And so on that front, they didn't even do a good enough job of like communicating what these changes were that they had implemented. They constantly got held up in their own internal strife with the likes of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema that actually undermined some of these bills. They were too procedurally invested in the Senate parliamentarian. There was supposed to be a bill that was going to pass with a simple majority that would have tacked on a federally mandated increase in $15 minimum wage. The Senate parliamentarian said no, and the Democrats went, "What are you going to do? It's the Senate parliamentarian." She said no. Okay, fire her, and then hire a new Senate parliamentarian. That's precisely what the Republicans had done under Dick Cheney, under the George W. Bush administration. There is no reason to hold up these procedures, and there's no reason to claim that you are the institutional norm defenders when in fact you have no respect for these institutions at the end of the day anyway, and you know for a fact that the Republicans are always going to violate those norms and violate these institutions in an effort to get whatever their agenda is across. And Democrats don't do that. They don't fight. And I think that people have lost confidence in them as well because of this. And they have a long way to go, I think, to recreate that trust in them.